In 1962, three men stood in Stockholm and accepted the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. They wore suits, they gave speeches, they shook hands with a king. The photographs from that evening show them smiling, the particular smile of men who have been told, repeatedly and by powerful institutions, that they deserve exactly what they have received. There is no photograph of Rosalind Franklin at that ceremony. There could not be. She had been dead for 4 years. She died in April 1958 in a hospital in Chelsea, London, of ovarian cancer. She was 37 years old. She had been working until weeks before the end, not because she had nothing else to do, but because the work was the thing she had built her entire life around: the molecules, the images. The meticulous, unforgiving pursuit of what was actually true, as opposed to what was convenient, or elegant, or what someone else had already decided before the data was in. She died without knowing the full scope of what had been done. That is perhaps the most unbearable part, not the theft itself, but the timing of it. The fact that the men who built their fame on the foundation she laid were still collecting honors long after the cancer had finished what the scientific establishment had started. She did not live to see the prize awarded. She did not live to read the speeches, or the books, or the self-congratulatory memoirs in which she appears, when she appears at all, as a minor character in someone else's story of genius. She was not a minor character, she was the architect. But before we go further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: not to catalog injustice as entertainment, not to reframe tragedy as content. This channel exists because there are women whose names have been deliberately, systematically removed from the rooms they built, and because someone has to be willing to stand in those rooms and say, "She was here." If that is why you came, subscribe. You are in the right place. Now, let us talk about what science actually looks like before we talk about what it gets called. Science, at the level Rosalind Franklin operated, is not a flash of inspiration. It is not a man sitting alone in a room and having a revelation. It is months, sometimes years, of painstaking, physically demanding, technically precise work. In Franklin's case, it was X-ray crystallography, a technique in which a crystallized sample is bombarded with X-ray beams, and the patterns of diffraction captured on photographic film are then analyzed, mathematically, to deduce the underlying molecular structure. The process required extreme precision. It required the operator to know exactly what she was looking at and exactly what it meant. Franklin knew. In the winter of 1952, she produced an image that would later be described, by the very men who used it without her permission, as one of the most beautiful X-ray photographs ever taken. It was designated Photo 51. It showed in perfect, crystalline clarity the helical structure of DNA. She had not published it yet. She was still working, still checking. Still doing what rigorous science actually demands, which is making certain before you declare. Someone else was not so patient. Someone else saw that photograph, without her knowledge, without her consent, through a back channel she was never told about, and understood immediately what it meant. And then that someone went back to his laboratory and built a model and put his name on the discovery. She found out the way the rest of the world did. That is where this story begins, not in Stockholm. Not in the speeches or the medals or the footnotes of history. It begins in a darkroom in London, where a woman is alone with the truth and does not yet know that the truth is already being taken from her. Rosalind Elsie Franklin was born on the 25th of July, 1920, into a family that took intelligence seriously and expected it to mean something. The Franklins were a prominent Anglo-Jewish family in London, educated, civic-minded, deeply embedded in the kind of intellectual life that treated ideas as obligations rather than ornaments. Her father, Ellis Franklin, was a banker and an amateur scientist who taught part-time at the Working Men's College. Her mother was capable and organized, and held the family together with the particular quiet authority of women who are never credited for the architecture they maintain. Rosalind was the second of 5 children. She was, by every account of those who knew her, early, exceptional, and she knew it, not with arrogance, but with the calm certainty of someone who has tested herself repeatedly and found no ceiling yet. She was good at everything school asked of her. She was better at the things it did not. At 15, she had already decided she would be a scientist, not a teacher of science, not a secretary in a laboratory, a scientist. The distinction mattered enormously in 1935, and everyone in her life understood that, including her father, who, to his complicated credit, both recognized her ability and struggled with it. He wanted her to do something useful with her education, meaning something charitable, meaning something that did not require her to compete directly with men in spaces men considered theirs. She declined politely and permanently, and enrolled at Newnham College, Cambridge, in 1938 to read natural sciences. Cambridge in the late 1930s was a particular kind of cold. Not the weather, though the weather was also cold. The cold that mattered was institutional. Women had been studying at Cambridge for nearly 70 years by the time Rosalind Franklin arrived, but they were not granted full membership of the university. They could attend lectures, they could sit examinations, they could, if they were good enough, receive a degree, but not a Cambridge degree, a certificate, a document that said, in the careful language of exclusion, you performed as well as the men, but you are not what we mean when we say Cambridge man. Full membership for women would not come until 1948. Franklin left in 1941, with results that should have earned her a scholarship, carrying a credential the university had deliberately made worth less than it should have been. She did not dwell on it. This is important to understand about Rosalind Franklin. She was not a woman who performed her wounds. She did not, as far as the historical record shows, spend significant energy being publicly bitter about the structural injustices she navigated daily. She simply moved through them, recalibrated, and kept working. This has sometimes been used against her, framed as evidence that the obstacles were not so bad, that she managed fine, that the difficulties were exaggerated by later feminist readings of her story. That framing is its own kind of theft. Managing fine under unjust conditions is not evidence that the conditions were just. It is evidence of extraordinary endurance. There is a difference. After Cambridge, she worked for the British Coal Utilisation Research Association, studying the porosity of coal, unglamorous, precise, necessary work that produced results significant enough to form the basis of her doctoral thesis. She was awarded her PhD from Cambridge in 1945. She was 25. Then Paris. If there is a period in Rosalind Franklin's life that the people who loved her describe with uncomplicated warmth, it is the 4 years she spent in Paris from 1947 to 1950, working at the Laboratoire Central des Services Chimiques de l'État under Jacques Mering. She learned X-ray crystallography there, learned it properly from one of its masters, and she was, by every account, brilliant at it, more than brilliant. She had the particular gift that separates good scientists from great ones. She could look at a diffraction pattern, at what is essentially a shadow of a molecular structure, and read it, interpret it, hold the ambiguity long enough to find the truth inside it rather than the nearest convenient answer. She was happy in Paris. She had colleagues who respected her. She had friends. She ate well, dressed well, hiked in the Alps on weekends with a physicality and joy that surprises people who have only encountered her through the cold light of how her story ended. She spoke French fluently and preferred the directness of French scientific culture, the willingness to argue, to disagree openly, to treat intellectual combat as a form of respect rather than aggression. She was 30 years old when she left Paris for London. She did not want to go, but there was a position at King's College, a fellowship, working with the physicist John Randall, using X-ray crystallography to study biological molecules. DNA had recently been identified as the molecule that carries genetic information. The field was electric with possibility. It was the kind of work that justified leaving somewhere you were happy for somewhere you might make history. She left, she arrived. She set up her laboratory with characteristic precision and began her work. And almost immediately, she walked into a situation that had already been arranged without her knowledge, by people who had already decided who she was before she opened her mouth. The misunderstanding, if we are being generous enough to call it that, began before Rosalind Franklin unpacked a single piece of equipment. John Randall, the director of the biophysics unit at King's College, had written her a letter in December 1950, outlining the terms of her fellowship. The letter was specific. She would work on the X-ray crystallography of DNA. She would have her own samples, her own equipment, her own research direction. The project was hers. That is what the letter said. That is what she understood, reasonably and correctly, based on the plain meaning of the words she had been sent. What Randall had neglected to mention, and the omission was not accidental, because nothing in an institution like King's College in 1951 was accidental, was that a man named Maurice Wilkins had already been working on DNA in the same unit, and that Wilkins had not been told, clearly or at all, that Franklin's arrival would redefine the boundaries of his own project. Wilkins was away when Franklin arrived. He returned to find a woman installed in the laboratory, working on what he had understood to be his problem. He assumed she was his assistant. She was not his assistant. She was his colleague, his equal in rank, and by any honest assessment of their respective technical abilities at that specific moment, his superior in the method that was going to matter most. But Wilkins did not see that. He could not, or would not, organize the world in a way that made it visible. And so, from the very first weeks of Rosalind Franklin's time at King's College, the relationship between them was corroded by a misalignment that neither of them had created, but both of them were expected to navigate. In an institution that had no interest in resolving it cleanly because resolving it cleanly would have required someone in authority to say, out loud, that Rosalind Franklin's work was her own and that no one else had claim to it. No one said that. Instead, what happened was a year of grinding, daily, low-grade institutional hostility, the kind that does not announce itself as sexism because it never has to. It arrives as tone. As the assumption that Franklin's caution was obstructionism rather than rigor. As the suggestion, repeated in private and eventually in print, that she was cold, difficult, unapproachable. That she lacked the collaborative spirit that good science required. What she lacked was the willingness to be overridden. These are not the same thing. Meanwhile, she worked. In the spring of 1952, Franklin and her graduate student Raymond Gosling made a technical decision that would determine the course of molecular biology. They had been working with DNA samples that could exist in two distinct forms, the A form, dry and crystalline, and the B form, hydrated and structurally distinct. Most researchers in the field at that point were focused on the A form. Franklin understood, with the precision that came from months of meticulous work, that the B form was more biologically relevant, and that it was the B form that needed to be photographed clearly. She adjusted the humidity in the X-ray apparatus. She prepared the sample. She and Gosling exposed the photographic film for approximately 100 hours. The result was photo 51, a single image, black and white. An X pattern at the center, what crystallographers call a meridional reflection, surrounded by a series of arcs that encoded, for anyone who knew how to read them, the precise helical geometry of the DNA molecule. The pitch of the helix, the spacing of the base pairs, the number of chains, the answer was in the photograph. Franklin knew what she was looking at. She did not rush. She continued her methodical analysis of the A form, building toward a complete structural understanding from multiple angles, because that was how she worked, and because she was right to work that way. She filed photo 51 in her records. She continued. In January 1953, without her knowledge and without her consent, Morris Wilkins showed photo 51 to a man named James Watson. Watson was visiting King's College informally. He was 24 years old, brash, and by his own later admission, not especially proficient in X-ray crystallography. He had been working with Francis Crick at Cambridge's Cavendish Laboratory on the DNA structure problem, working largely theoretically, building physical models, trying to reason their way to an answer that the experimental data had not yet conclusively confirmed for them. Wilkins showed him the photograph. Watson looked at it for less than a minute. He later wrote, with a casualness that functions almost as a confession, that the instant he saw it his mouth fell open and his pulse began to race. He understood immediately what it meant. He did not ask whose work it was. He did not ask whether the person who had taken it had been consulted. He memorized what he saw, returned to Cambridge, and within weeks he and Crick had used the structural data encoded in Franklin's image, along with a report from the Medical Research Council that contained further unpublished results from her work, also shared without her knowledge, to build their now famous double helix model. They published in Nature in April 1953. Rosalind Franklin's name was not on the paper. She was acknowledged, briefly, for her general knowledge of the subject, a phrase so precisely calibrated to diminish that it functions almost as evidence of intent. Not for her data, not for her photograph, not for the experimental foundation without which the model could not have been built, for her general knowledge. She was 32 years old. She was in the same building. She was never asked. She was never asked. Here is what did not happen next. There was no confrontation, no formal inquiry, no moment in which someone in authority sat Watson and Crick and Wilkins down in a room and asked them directly to account for how they had arrived at their model and whose work had made it possible. There was no investigation. There was no retraction. There was no letter from the editors of Nature asking for clarification about the provenance of the structural data on which the paper rested. The world simply moved on. And Rosalind Franklin, because she was Rosalind Franklin, because she did not perform her wounds, because she had been trained by circumstance and institution to absorb injustice and recalibrate and continue, moved on to, or appeared to, what she actually knew, in the spring of 1953, about the full extent of what had been done, is one of the genuine historical uncertainties of this story. She knew the Watson-Crick paper had been published. She knew it described a double helix. She knew her own work had been proceeding toward the same conclusion. Whether she knew that Watson had seen photo 51, whether she understood the precise mechanism by which her data had been funneled to Cambridge without her consent, that is less clear. The picture emerged gradually, over years, assembled from memoirs and letters and interviews given long after the fact by men who understood, by the time they were speaking, that they needed to be careful about exactly how much they admitted. What is clear is this: she was not credited, she was not consulted, she was not included. And King's College, the institution that had managed her so carelessly from the beginning, now made one final administrative decision about her future. She was told, not asked, to transfer her DNA work entirely to Wilkins and to move to Birkbeck College, where she would work on tobacco mosaic virus instead. She left King's College in the spring of 1953. She took nothing with her. She was not permitted to continue her DNA research. She left behind her notebooks, her data, her photographs, including Photo 51, which remained in the King's College files under Raymond Gosling's name, where it would sit, quietly, for years. She started again. This is the part of Rosalind Franklin's story that demands to be looked at directly, because it is the part most easily collapsed into a narrative of victimhood that she herself would have rejected. She was not broken by what happened at King's. She arrived at Birkbeck College and she built something. Under J.D. Bernal, a scientist who treated her as a peer, who gave her autonomy, who understood what he had when she walked into his laboratory, she produced some of the finest work of her career. Her research on tobacco mosaic virus was meticulous and original. Her work on plant viruses laid foundations that other scientists would build on for decades. She published. She presented at conferences. She was, by the standards of what her field asked of her, succeeding. She was also, quietly and without telling most of her colleagues, dying. In 1956, Rosalind Franklin was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She was 35 years old. She had the diagnosis and she had the work, and she chose, with the same controlled determination she had applied to everything else, to keep the two things separate. She told almost no one. She continued to work. She underwent surgery. She recovered. She relapsed. She continued to work. She underwent more surgery. She continued to work. There is something almost unbearable about this detail, the image of a woman who has spent her entire career being told, in 100 institutional languages, that she is not quite what they meant. That her contributions are adjacent rather than central, that her name belongs in the acknowledgments rather than the byline, that woman spending her final years producing rigorous, original, important science. In a building where she was respected, for a field she loved, without complaint, without self-pity, without stopping. She did not stop. She published her last paper weeks before she died. Meanwhile, and this is where the spiral tightens, where the air gets thin, Watson and Crick were ascending. The double helix model had been absorbed into the scientific consensus with remarkable speed. Its elegance made it persuasive. Its persuasiveness made it famous. Its fame made its authors famous, and their fame had the particular self-reinforcing quality of institutional recognition. Each award, each lecture invitation, each honorary degree making the next one more certain, each public acknowledgement calcifying their names as the men who had cracked the code of life. Watson, specifically, was becoming a figure. Young, quotable, charismatic in the brittle way of men who have been told they are brilliant before they have finished becoming who they are. He was building the story of the discovery in real time, in conversations and lectures and casual remarks, and the story he was building had a shape, a heroic shape, a shape in which two young Cambridge men had the inspired audacity to solve a problem that the experimental scientists, with their slow data and their methodical caution, had not been able to crack. In this story, Rosalind Franklin was an obstacle, not a contributor, not a peer. An obstacle, a difficult woman who had been sitting on data she refused to interpret correctly, whose rigidity had slowed the field, whose temperament had made collaboration impossible. This was not a new accusation. It was the same accusation that had followed her from King's College, the same vocabulary of difficulty and coldness that institutions deploy against women who do not make themselves easy to use. But now it was being attached to the most consequential scientific story of the century, and it was being told by men whose version of events was the one getting written down. She was not there to contradict it. She was never going to be there to contradict it. The cancer returned in the autumn of 1957. This time she knew, with the clarity that comes when the body stops being ambiguous, that there would be no further recovery. She was in and out of the hospital through the winter. She stayed with friends when she could. She worked when she was able. She did not, as far as anyone who knew her has recorded, spend those months in bitterness or in the backward-looking grief of someone cataloging their losses. She spent them working. In March 1958, she was admitted to the Royal Marsden Hospital. She died on the 16th of April. It was a Wednesday. The spring outside was just beginning. There is a photograph of Rosalind Franklin that most people have never seen, not Photo 51, not the X-ray, not the image that changed everything and bore someone else's telling of it into history, a different photograph. A personal one, she is outdoors, the Alps most likely, one of the hiking trips she took through her 20s and 30s with the same discipline, joy she brought to everything else. She is wearing practical clothes. Her hair is dark and loose. She is not posing in the way that people pose when they know they are being photographed for an occasion. There is no performance in it, no careful arrangement of the face for posterity. She is simply there, present. Alive in the particular way of people who are doing exactly what they chose to do, in a place they chose to be, in a body that is working well and carrying them forward. She looks happy, not relieved, not vindicated. Not triumphant in the way we sometimes retroactively assign to people whose stories we know end badly, as if awareness of future suffering would have shadowed every earlier moment of ease. She looks like a woman in her 30s who is good at being alive, who has friends and appetites and opinions and plans, who will, when she gets back from this walk, write letters and eat dinner and think about her next experiment and argue, with characteristic precision, about something that matters to her. She looks like someone with more time. I have thought about that photograph more than I can easily explain. I have thought about the specific cruelty of the gap between that image and what we know came after, not the professional theft, though that is its own violence, but the simple biological fact of 37 years. The fact that the woman in that photograph, the one with the loose hair and the practical boots and the look of someone entirely sufficient to herself, was given 37 years and then no more. That the cancer that killed her was, in its particular indifference, the final indignity of a life that had been shaped by indifferences, institutional, professional, personal, that never announced themselves as malice but accumulated quietly into erasure. She did not get to be old. She did not get to sit in a room somewhere in her 60s or 70s and read Watson's memoir, the one he published in 1968, 10 years after her death, the one in which he described her as Rosie, a nickname she never used and reportedly disliked, and portrayed her as a humorless obstructionist whose failure to interpret her own data had nearly derailed the discovery and respond to it. She did not get to write her own account. She did not get to stand in front of an audience and say, with the quiet authority of someone who has the data to back it up, here is what actually happened, and here is what it means, and here is my name. She was 37. She had been dead for a decade before the people who took from her were fully celebrated for what they took. She was dead before the question of what she deserved was even properly formed. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to lives cut short before the reckoning arrives, before the world catches up to what was owed. It is different from ordinary grief. It has a quality of permanent suspension to it, like a sentence that was never finished, a door left open onto a room no one will ever enter now. Rosalind Franklin did not get her reckoning. She got a grave in Willesden Jewish Cemetery, a modest headstone, and an epitaph that described her as a pioneer of the X-ray study of biomolecules. Accurate, restrained, insufficient. 4 years later in Stockholm, 3 men accepted a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA. In the speeches that followed, her name was not spoken. The spring outside was beautiful that year too. She was not there to see it. Let us be precise about what happened. Not emotional, not rhetorical, precise. Because the temptation at this point in Rosalind Franklin's story is to locate the wrongdoing in a small number of individual men and to stop there, to name Watson, to name Wilkins, to assign personal culpability and close the case. That accounting is not wrong. Watson and Wilkins made specific choices that had specific consequences for a specific woman, and those choices deserve to be named. But if we stop at the individuals, we miss the architecture. We miss the system that made those choices not only possible but functionally invisible, that surrounded them with so much institutional normalcy that the men who made them could, and did, spend decades not fully understanding what they had done, or understanding it perfectly and simply not caring, which amounts to the same thing from where Rosalind Franklin was standing. So let us talk about the architecture. In 1951, when Rosalind Franklin arrived at King's College, the institution's dining arrangements were formally segregated by sex. The senior common room, where the daily lunches happened, where the informal conversations that constitute the real currency of collaborative science took place, where alliances were built and ideas were tested and the social fabric of the department was maintained, was for men only. Franklin ate elsewhere, not occasionally, not as an exception, but as a matter of institutional policy, every day, for the entirety of her time there. Consider what that means in practice. Science is not conducted only in the laboratory. It is conducted in the corridor, at the lunch table, in the casual exchange after a seminar where someone says, "I've been thinking about your results," and someone else says, "So have I, actually," and an idea begins to form that neither of them would have reached alone. It is conducted in the accumulated daily texture of being present, of being visible, of being included in the ambient conversation of a community. Rosalind Franklin was excluded from that texture by institutional design. Every single day, and no one at any level of King's College appears to have found this arrangement troubling enough to change it. This is not incidental, this is structural. The dining room is a metaphor only in the way that all concrete facts are metaphors. It stands for the 10,000 smaller exclusions that accumulate into the erasure of a person from the professional life they were entitled to. The assumption that she was Wilkins' assistant rather than his equal, the failure of Randall to clarify her status before she arrived, the ease with which her data was discussed, shared, and used in conversations she was never part of. The institutional silence that followed the publication of the Watson-Crick paper, the silence that said, in the vocabulary of systems rather than individuals, this is not a problem we intend to address. None of it required malice. This is the part that matters most and the part that is hardest to hold. The system did not need to hate Rosalind Franklin to destroy her. It only needed to be indifferent. It only needed to treat her the way it treated all women, as adjacent, as supplementary, as useful for the data they could produce, but not for the conclusions they might draw from it, not for the authority they might claim over their own work, not for the name on the door. The system was not designed around her destruction. It was designed around her irrelevance. Her destruction was simply what irrelevance looks like when the work you are doing is important enough to be taken. And it was taken cleanly because the system made that clean. When Watson and Wilkins, who were not close friends, who had their own tensions, their own professional friction, could nonetheless unite, however briefly and informally, in a moment of mutual convenience to share a woman's unpublished data with each other, and with Cambridge, they were not acting against the culture of their institution. They were acting in complete alignment with it. The culture said, data belongs to the project, not the person. The culture said, collaboration across teams is a virtue. The culture said, in every language available to it. Women's work is a resource, not a claim. They followed the culture. The culture was never asked to answer for itself. Then there is the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, by its own rules, cannot be awarded posthumously. Rosalind Franklin died in 1958. The prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA was awarded in 1962. This is often presented as a tragic coincidence, as if the timing were simply unfortunate, as if death had intervened at the worst possible moment and denied her what she might otherwise have received. That framing asks us to extend a generosity to the Nobel Committee that the evidence does not entirely support. The structure of DNA was known to be one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the century within years of the 1953 publication. The conversation about a Nobel Prize for the double helix began early and proceeded openly. Rosalind Franklin was alive and working and publishing for 5 years of that conversation. There is no record of her name being formally considered. There is no document indicating that the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences was, in those 5 years, actively deliberating over whether to include her. She was not overlooked because she died too soon. She was overlooked before she died. And after she died, the rules provided a clean institutional reason to stop asking the question, a reason that looked like policy rather than prejudice, that looked like procedure rather than the final, permanent, administrative confirmation of everything that had been done to her while she was alive. Watson published his memoir in 1968. The Double Helix is a remarkable document, not because it is accurate, but because it is honest in precisely the wrong ways. It is honest about the culture it emerged from, honest about the way women were perceived and discussed and used in that culture, honest about Watson's own attitude toward Franklin with a casualness that functions as indictment. He called her Rosie throughout, the nickname no one who knew her used. He described her appearance before her science. He wrote that the thought of her made him uneasy, and that the source of his unease was her refusal to behave the way he expected women in science to behave, which is to say, helpfully deferentially, as a support structure for the ambitions of men. The book was a bestseller. It was celebrated as a candid, human account of how great science actually gets done. It was reviewed, almost universally, by men. Anne Sayer, one of Franklin's closest friends, spent years after Franklin's death assembling the corrective record, interviewing colleagues, reviewing documents, building the case for what had actually happened. Her biography of Franklin, published in 1975, was the first serious public account to argue directly that Franklin had been wronged, that her data had been used without her consent, and that the story as it had been told was incomplete in ways that were not accidental. It took 17 years after Franklin's death for someone to say it in print. 17 years. The men who had built their careers on her work did not wait 17 years to be celebrated. They did not wait at all. They did not wait at all. In the last year of her life, Rosalind Franklin moved between hospitals and the homes of friends with the quiet practicality of someone who has accepted a fact without surrendering to it. She stayed frequently with Anne Sayer and her husband, who lived in London and who understood, as close friends do, that what she needed was not to be treated as a woman who was dying, but as a woman who was still, emphatically, determinedly, sometimes exhaustingly, living. They gave her a room, they had dinner together, they argued about things. Franklin was, by every account of those who knew her well, a vivid presence at a table, opinionated and funny and capable of a dry, precise wit that the institutional portraits of her as cold and difficult have largely failed to capture, because the institutional portraits were drawn by people who were not at her table. She was not, in private, the woman Watson described. She was not a woman who could be adequately described by anyone who had chosen, in advance, what kind of woman she was. She was, in the winter of 1957 and into 1958, also in significant pain. The cancer had spread. The treatments available were brutal and limited in the way of medical science in the late 1950s, which had the knowledge to identify what was killing her, but not yet the means to stop it. She underwent surgeries. She recovered partially. She declined again. She had been awarded a fellowship to visit the United States in the summer of 1956 and had presented her work, had visited colleagues, had hiked in the American West with the same physical appetite she brought to everything, and had come home and continued, and the cancer had come back and she had continued again. There is a letter written by Franklin to a colleague in early 1958, a few months before she died. It is, by the standards of what she knew about her own condition by that point, an extraordinary document. It does not dwell, it does not lament, it discusses ongoing work. It asks questions about a problem she was still thinking through. It makes a small joke. It expresses in the compressed professional language she used for correspondence, something that reads unmistakably as pleasure, the pleasure of a mind still engaged, still finding the problems worth the attention, still here. She mailed that letter. She then went back to work. In March 1958, she was admitted to the Royal Marsden Hospital for the last time. She was 37 years old. The spring was starting outside. The particular tentative spring of London, cautious and gray-green, the city not yet certain it was done with winter. She had spent 20 years of her professional life in that city, in its laboratories and its corridors and its dining rooms she had not been permitted to enter, and she had produced, in those 20 years, a body of work that the field she loved would spend decades catching up to. She died on the 16th of April, 1958, and here is the detail that I have turned over and over in my mind since I first encountered it. The one that does not announce itself as significant, that sits in the historical record quietly, without drama, and then will not leave. When Rosalind Franklin died, her colleagues at Birkbeck College continued the work she had been doing on plant viruses. The research she had led, the tobacco mosaic virus work, the papers she had published, the structural determinations she had made with the same meticulous precision she had brought to DNA 5 years earlier, was ongoing. It was important. It was the kind of work that gets completed and published and absorbed into the field and builds, incrementally, into the foundation of things that come later. Her colleagues finished the papers. They listed her as a co-author. On papers published after her death, her name appeared. On the discovery that defined the century, the one she had made possible, the one that her photograph had unlocked, the one that Watson and Crick had published in 1953 with a footnote where her credit should have been, her name did not appear. Her name appeared on the papers that were finished after she was gone. Her name did not appear on the paper that should never have been finished without her. That is the architecture of the theft, made visible in a single comparison. The work small enough to be safely credited, attributed. The work large enough to be worth taken. The distinction was not scientific. The distinction was not about methodology or contribution or merit. The distinction was about what was at stake, about whose name on which paper would change whose life, whose career, whose place in history. Her name on the virus papers changed nothing for the men around her. Her name on the DNA paper would have changed everything, so her name was not on the DNA paper. She is buried in Willesden Jewish Cemetery in northwest London. The headstone is simple. The epitaph, as I mentioned, calls her a pioneer of the X-ray study of biomolecules. Her parents are buried nearby. The grave is well maintained. People leave stones on it now, the Jewish tradition of visitation, of marking that you were here, that you came, that you remember. The stones accumulate. I think about who leaves them. I think about the women who make the journey to Willesden and stand at that headstone and read the words and understand, in their bodies as much as their minds, exactly what those words contain and exactly what they leave out. I think about what it means to stand at a grave and know that the person beneath it was cheated of the only currency that science officially recognizes: priority, publication. The permanent record of who got there first, and that the cheating was done so cleanly, so institutionally, so thoroughly laundered through the normal operations of a system that had never been designed to give her anything in the first place. That it took decades for the full picture to be assembled. I think about what it means that assembling it fell to the people who loved her, not to the institutions, not to the journals, not to the Nobel Committee, which has never, not once, in the 60-plus years since the prize was awarded, issued a formal acknowledgement that Rosalind Franklin's contribution to the discovery of the structure of DNA was foundational, decisive, and uncredited. Not to Watson, who revised his account of her slightly in later editions of his book after the public pressure became sufficient to require it, and who described his revisions as a generous act rather than a minimal one, which tells you everything you need to know about what he understood himself to have taken. To the people who loved her, to Anne Sayer, who spent years of her own life making sure the record existed, to the students and the scientists and the strangers who go to Willesden and leave stones. The stones are there because the official record failed. The official record failed because it was never designed to succeed, not for her, not for women like her, not for the people the system had always understood as resources rather than authors of their own work. She gave them the shape of life. They gave her a footnote. She was 37 years old, and the spring kept coming, every year without her. Here is what happened to the men. James Watson received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1962, shared with Francis Crick and Maurice Wilkins. He was 34 years old. He gave a speech. He was celebrated. He went on to become one of the most famous scientists in the world, director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, chancellor, public intellectual, the face of molecular biology for a generation of students who learned the double helix story from textbooks that mentioned Rosalind Franklin, if they mentioned her at all, in a single subordinate clause. He wrote his memoir. It was celebrated. He gave interviews. They were published. He received honorary degrees, named lectureships, lifetime achievement awards, the full ceremonial weight of an establishment confirming its own choices. In 2007, he gave an interview to a British newspaper in which he said that he was inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa, because all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. He said he hoped everyone was equal, but that people who have to deal with black employees find this not true. He was 90 years old when, in 2019, the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory stripped him of his honorary titles following a documentary in which he repeated and expanded on those views. The institution that had celebrated him for decades finally found something he had done that it could not absorb. It was not Rosalind Franklin. It was never Rosalind Franklin. Francis Crick received the Nobel Prize. He went on to a distinguished career in neuroscience. He died in 2004, at 88, having lived a full professional life of recognition and reward, and was eulogized as one of the great scientific minds of the 20th century. The eulogies were accurate about his intelligence. They were less careful about the foundations it had been built on. Maurice Wilkins received the Nobel Prize. He lived until 2004 as well, 88 years old, the same age as Crick, the age of men who are given time. He acknowledged in later years, with the careful language of partial admission, that Franklin had not been treated well. He said the situation at King's College had been difficult. He expressed in the muted vocabulary of institutional regret something that approached but never quite became an apology. He had 64 years after her death to find the words. He did not find them. Now here is what happened to the work. The structure of DNA, the double helix, the base pairs, the fundamental molecular architecture of biological inheritance became the foundation of modern genetics, molecular biology, genomics, and every field that grew from them. The Human Genome Project, gene therapy, CRISPR, the mRNA vaccines that moved through the world in 2020 and 2021 with a speed that felt like miracle, but was actually the accumulated product of 70 years of molecular biology, built on the understanding of how genetic information is stored, copied, and expressed. All of it rests at its foundation on the structure. The structure rests at its foundation on Photo 51. Photo 51 was taken by Rosalind Franklin. There is a direct, unbroken line from that photograph to every cancer treatment designed around genetic targeting, every inherited disease diagnosed through genomic sequencing, every child born healthy because a genetic condition was identified before it could take hold. That line exists because a woman in a London laboratory in 1952 prepared her sample with extraordinary care, set her humidity controls with extraordinary precision, and waited 100 hours for an image that would tell her what she already suspected was true. She was right, she is in all of it. Her name is on almost none of it. The rehabilitation, when it came slowly and from below. Anne Sayre's biography in 1975, scholarly articles through the 1980s. The gradual, grudging reassessment of the historical record as more documents became available, as the letters were archived, as Watson's account was read against the evidence rather than alongside it. Brenda Maddox's definitive biography, Rosalind Franklin, The Dark Lady of DNA, published in 2002, which assembled the full picture with the precision and authority the subject deserved, and which reached an audience far beyond the scientific community. The Royal Society established the Rosalind Franklin Award in 2003, given annually to an individual or organization for contributions to the promotion of women in science, engineering, and technology. NASA named a Mars rover after her. Universities named buildings after her. Schools named themselves after her. The Google Doodle on what would have been her 93rd birthday reached hundreds of millions of people who had never heard her name before that morning. All of it posthumous, all of it retrospective, all of it the kind of recognition that arrives after the person it honors can no longer use it, after it can no longer change the daily texture of being a woman in a laboratory who is asked to eat elsewhere, whose data is discussed in rooms she is not invited into, who is called difficult for the crime of knowing her own work was her own. The recognition is not nothing. It matters that her name is spoken. It matters that students learn it. It matters that the rover is on Mars carrying her name across a landscape she would have found extraordinary, doing science she would have loved, in the name of the pursuit she gave her life to. But there's a question that the commemorations do not answer, that the awards and the biographies and the Google Doodles and the named buildings cannot answer, because it is not a question about legacy. It is a question about what was owed. In 2021, a paper published in the journal Nature used newly examined archival material to argue that Franklin was closer to independently solving the DNA structure than had previously been acknowledged, that her notebooks showed she had, by early 1953, arrived at an understanding of the B form that was converging rapidly on the double helix. That if Watson had not seen Photo 51 in January of that year, if the MRC report had not been shared without her consent, if the normal operations of science, the operations that require you to wait for a colleague to publish before you build on their work, had been observed, she might well have published first. She might have been the one to crack it. She might have been the one in Stockholm. She might have been the one whose name children learn first, automatically, without having to be corrected. We will never know. That not knowing is its own kind of verdict. Here is mine. Rosalind Franklin did not fail to receive credit because she died too young, though she did die too young. She did not fail to receive credit because the Nobel rules forbid posthumous awards, though they do. She did not fail to receive credit because the contributions of women to collaborative science are genuinely difficult to disentangle, though that difficulty is often invoked as cover for a simpler reality. She failed to receive credit because the system she worked in was designed, at every level, to make her work available to men who had not done it, and to make her name unavailable to the discoveries that proved it. The dining room. The failed briefing, the shared photograph, the MRC report, the footnote acknowledgement, the memoir, the Nobel speeches, each one a separate decision made by a separate person in a separate moment, and yet each one pointing in the same direction, producing the same result, with the same person on the wrong side of every outcome. That is not bad luck. That is a system working as intended. She was 37 years old. She had produced in those 37 years more rigorous, more original, more consequential scientific work than most researchers produce in a full career. She had done it in institutions that excluded her from their dining rooms. She had done it alongside colleagues who assumed she was their assistant. She had done it while navigating the particular exhaustion of being the woman in the room who must prove, again and again and again, that she belongs in the room. She did it anyway, not for the prize, not for the footnote, not for the Google Doodle or the Mars rover or the award given in her name to other women fighting the same fights in updated versions of the same institutions. She did it because the molecules were real and the questions were worth answering, and the truth was there in the diffraction pattern if you were patient enough and precise enough and willing enough to wait 100 hours in the dark for an image that would tell you what life is made of. She knew what life was made of. The world learned it from her. The world forgot to say her name. This channel will not forget. If you watched this far, you already understand why this work matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear her name. Subscribe if you believe the buried ones deserve to be found. And if there is a woman whose story you think we have not told yet, leave her name in the comments. We are listening. We are listening.